the issue of the sheer scale of the Iraqi displacement was something that has really only been an issue of major international political and public discourse, I think for the last sort of 6, 8, 9 months, something like that. But I hope I'm not boring you with, because I think these figures are now well known, but they do bear repeating. The displacement of Iraqi refugees in Iraq is of an absolutely epic, if you look and if you think about it in geographical terms, quite appropriately biblical proportions really. There's I think it's getting up now to 4.4 million people have been displaced. An absolutely enormous movement of people, about half and half internally and into neighbouring countries, which is the biggest displacement since 1948 and the Palestinian displacement. And as many people have drawn the parallel, look at the consequences of that original displacement of Palestine. Look at how that has convulsed the world, the failure to do something about that one, even 50 years on. If we don't do something about this Iraqi situation, we have basically got another, we're going to have another running international sore that even if we don't care about the people involved, is going to have implications for us in the West, because clearly there has been massive implications for the total failure to solve the tragedy of Palestine. If you look at the numbers, and again there's this issue about where do we stand in all this. We're very careful in a sense, because it's not our job to criticise the government over starting the war in Iraq. And we're also very conscious that we don't want to get into a situation where saying that Britain only has responsibilities for refugees from conflicts that Britain started, because we might get that thrown back at us when they say, well, why should we take anyone from DRC, for instance, nothing to do with us. So, but there is, let's face it, there is, I think, a particular symbolic responsibility on Britain to do something about Iraq, because we are involved in that situation.
In terms of international, but particularly Europe, yeah. Which is the country that takes in the most refugees, and how does that country cope in a sense with them? Or are we the biggest taker of refugees?
Well, it varies, of course. No, we've rarely been the biggest. Obviously, in terms of migration, it's usually countries like the US takes, there's huge migration flows into the US, and the US has always taken a lot of refugees on resettlement. They don't have much of a history of what's called spontaneous arrival, which is what the classic, you turn up at an airport or a port and say, I'm from somewhere. Partly I think it's the geography of America. Obviously most of the flows across borders there are from Latin America, and that's more of a sort of economic migration flow. America has quite a good record, it does by comparison with Europe anyway, of actively resettling refugees. They have 100,000 in a year, that sort of thing. That scale of program, which just dwarfs anything we've ever faced. We had a spike in our asylum numbers in the early 2000s, where it went up. At one stage, it was running at about 120,000 a year at its absolute peak, and that was a massive increase on what we'd had before. And I think that it would be crude and wrong to suggest that there wasn't anything in the public alarm and the political concern about that issue at that time. We didn't have the mechanisms to cope with that number of people, and there was a sense of chaos and lack of control, and that caused concern. I would argue that the number was never really an issue. 120,000 in a population of 60 million, we could cope with that number in terms of infrastructure and economy, but the systems weren't in place to deal with it. Now the systems are better, and they're not perfect, but they're better. We're coping with very, very low numbers now. The actual number of people coming into the UK now is been running fairly flatlining around 25,000 a year. Saying, I don't know, we always use these sort of football parallels, but I don't know what the capacity at Leeds United, but I guess maybe 25,000 people go to a football match at Leeds at the weekend. That's the number in a year that come and make a claim for asylum, and most of them get refused, and a goodly proportion of them will be removed.
Yeah, I think it was fairly recently that one of the first islands disappeared as a result of the rising sea levels caused by global warming.
Yeah.
So I had a couple of questions related to climate change, global warming, and refugees, because obviously it's been predicted that there will be a massive increase in migration as a result of extreme weather and so on. I wondered how that affects the dynamics say, conflict and other wars, and then what the sort of policies are, or what sort of research is being done to anticipate some of these changes?
Well, on the latter, I think it's beginning to start in that people are recognising this. We've recently been having a internal, what you call a strategic planning exercise for the Refugee Council itself, so looking at what we might be doing in the future. And when our own staff groups were looking at what might be big issues for us over the next 10 years or so, this was one that came up a lot, is that we're going to start having the first really sort of recognisable, if you like, environmental refugees coming up. And one of the issues that will confront us there is that when I was doing an interview for sorry, I forget your name, but
International Affairs.
International Affairs. But here, that question was asked about the business about does the 1951 Convention is it adequate to deal with the problems that people need protection for? And the answer is clearly no. It's a product of history, and it's written in its time. It already doesn't nearly really capture the situations, particularly around gender issues, sexual orientation issues, things like that. You know, there aren't grounds under the 51 Convention to claim asylum on the basis of being persecuted for your sexuality, for instance, because it's just something they didn't think about or want to talk about in 1951. You know, and so the convention governing whether you were accorded protection internationally is going to be out of date because of these gathering phenomena. It already is. Again, if I go back to this business about African countries are much more, if you like, fluid and flexible about who they regard as a refugee. I mean, in a sense, if you're fleeing from your country because of persecution or what have you, you become, and you're outside your country and you're in a refugee camp, then you're a refugee and they recognise you as such. I think it will become an issue more and more for the West to think about how international instruments to provide protection for people who need it are adjusting to new situations, and that will have to be one of them, I think, because there will be people who won't face any form of persecution in the traditional sense and aren't being driven by conflict, but are clearly going to need somewhere to live and potentially protection. Particularly, I think, if as there might be, there's likely to be real pressure for space. So what you might find, I suspect, is that maybe what will happen is it's not that the people won't, as it were, end up getting protection or status or the right to come to Western countries as a first consequence of their land being flooded by rising sea levels or something, but it might be as a knock-on consequence because they move and that creates conflict situations and within the boundaries of these countries.